Welcome to the No BS Spiritual Book Club's live streaming interview series, where leading new thought teachers, speakers, and authors share the intimate stories behind the 10 best spiritual books that inspired them the most on their spiritual journey. From well-known classics to hidden gems you might never have heard of, the No BS Spiritual Book Club saves you time and money by sharing reliable recommendations from those who've walked the path before you. The No BS Spiritual Book Club, the only no BS guide to the best spiritual books to inspire your own journey of self-discovery. Here's your host, founder of the No BS Spiritual Book Club, Sandie Sedgbeer.
Hello. When a man's favourite books include mystics, scientists and rule breakers, you know he's not here to play it safe. From early fame in the 1960s as a pioneering documentary filmmaker to decades spent exploring the outer edges of consciousness, Daniel Drasin has spent over 30 years investigating what happens after we die through traditional mediums, reincarnation research, and even electronic communication with the other side. His groundbreaking book, A New Science of the Afterlife, Space, Time and the Consciousness Code, challenges the old materialist view that consciousness ends with the brain and offers a compelling case that we're just scratching the surface of what's really going on. Daniel Drasin joins me now to share the 10 books that influenced his life journey, along with why his research offers a new model of consciousness that doesn't end with the body. Daniel Drasin, welcome.
Thank you so much, Sandie. It's a pleasure to be here with you. My first response is, it's not my research.
It's not your research.
It's a tradition of research that goes back quite a ways. I position myself more as a journalist and an observer and someone who hopes to bring together the existing body of evidence, which has impressed me and has changed my life in many ways over the years. So anyway, credit where due to the. Now, this is not to say that I haven't had my share of paranormal experiences.
Which is a whole research
other story.
Yeah.
But I hope I've done a good job of pulling together the known evidence and research.
So you said in your write-up that you're not much of a reader, and you weren't much of a reader until you began focusing on afterlife research. I want to know what made you start researching that?
Well, it was two things. One, meeting a man named Mark Macy in the early mid-1990s. And Mark had done a huge amount of research and practice in instrumental transcommunication, which is communication between our side and the other side through electronics, through modern electronics. He had just written a book about it, and I was actually a bit skeptical at first. But after I really looked into it and met other people who had been doing this practice, I was quite convinced that this was legitimate. And that's what prompted me to team up with my co-producer, Tim Coleman, to produce 2 documentaries about afterlife communication through various means. That's the short of it. I also, speaking of books, there was a period of time also in the mid-90s when various books would sort of fall off bookshelves at me and call my attention to them. Robert Monroe's books were among those. He was a radio producer in New York City who started having out-of-body experiences back in the 1950s. Yeah. And he thought he was going crazy, so he had himself analyzed. And the shrinks told him there's nothing wrong with you. And one of them said, hey, what's happening to you is considered to be a skill by certain cultures, and you can develop it. So that led to his work in developing techniques for inducing out-of-body experiences. It's led to the Monroe Institute and so on. But that's a whole other side story. Anyway, those are among my first influences.
So in terms of, before we start going through the books, tell me, what was it like for you to have to distill the list of 10? Presumably, once you got going, on this genre, you kept going.
It was easy because these books stand out for me as probably the most inspiring and interesting and good reads in this whole field. I mean, once you accept even the possibility that the so-called objective world is not the whole story, it becomes a kind of an adventure to explore different individuals' perspective on why the objective world isn't the whole story. And of course, the objective world is itself a kind of a slippery concept in many ways. I once was a spiritual teacher I once knew who said, "We each create our own reality, and if you disagree with me, it proves my point."
Yeah.
So I can't presume to know how you or anyone else experiences their reality. All I can do is attempt to clarify my own perspective and see if it resonates with other people's, and see if the insights that I've collected are useful to people in freeing them from what's generally referred to as the illusion of physicality and so on. And I know that sounds a bit facile because we all have a sense of physicality being the real reality. And so getting around that, one of my very first influences actually as a child was that I began experiencing some precognitive dreams. And I didn't understand it, but it taught me a very important lesson. And that was that in the theater of life, stuff goes on backstage. So that became a favorite metaphor of mine, that when we're in the theater, what goes on backstage is none of our business. We've come there to enjoy the show or the performance or the concert or whatever it is. And the technicians and the lighting people and the sound people behind the scenes are just, they don't belong in our consciousness at the moment when we're simply enjoying life, as it were. But when we want to dig a little deeper and get behind the curtain, I think it certainly in my experience, it's led to a deeper and richer life, a more interesting and certainly stimulated my curiosity, my left brain curiosity. I've always been interested in science and technology. My career trajectories went first through industrial design, which is a marriage of art and science, and from then to filmmaking, which is another marriage of art and science. So I tend to gravitate towards a balance of these two qualities, more sort of the right-left brain balance, and that has informed my studies in this area of afterlife research, and it's certainly informed my own experience. I've had some really quite profound communications with the other side through a team of mediums that I've worked with for about 6 years now, and including communications with personal friends on the other side who
well, we'll talk about that a bit more.
Sure.
Yeah. Let's start with your first book, which is your favorite afterlife focus book, Post-Mortem Journal, Communications from T.E. Lawrence Through the Mediumship of Jane Sherwood, published in 1964. Why is this your favorite?
It's partly because it's one of the first books I encountered that really engaged me in this area. And just read the statement that I wrote about it. This is far and away my favorite afterlife focused book. Colonel T.E. Lawrence, a.k.a. Lawrence of Arabia, lived a swashbuckling but morally dubious life, and in his later years lived in relative obscurity. After his sudden death in a motorcycle accident in 1935, Lawrence found himself in a dark place. Soon he was rescued and brought to a sort of a healing community, where he was eventually able to confront his inner demons and grow past them. Eventually, he contacted British medium Jane Sherwood, and over a period of several years, dictated this remarkable narrative of his experience on the other side. The book is written in delicious early 20th century British English. It's a good read.
Okay, let's move on to the next one. I mean, I'm eager to know whether the different people that these authors, whether they all have different pictures of the afterlife. So let's look at book number 2, which is The Country Beyond, The Doctrine of Rebirth, also by Jane Sherwood. This one was published in 1969.
Yes, thank you for the subtitle, which I hadn't included. And I didn't include it because the subtitle is a bit misleading. The Doctrine of Rebirth or Reincarnation doesn't seem to be like a really main focus of the book. It's primarily her personal history of, let's go back to when she was first married, shortly before the First World War. When the war broke out, her husband, who didn't have a military bone in his body, suddenly, for some reason, decided he wanted to go and fight at the front. And he was, very quickly after that, he was killed. And so Jane made it her life's purpose to contact him. She went to various kinds of mediums and gurus and teachers and so on. And she was never satisfied with the veracity of the communications. But finally, having found one day her husband's handwriting coming through her own hand, she settled on automatic writing as a reliable means of connecting with the other side. And eventually developed a relationship with 3 folks on the other side. One was her husband, first one to come through. The second one was T.E. Lawrence, who at that time was sort of casting about for someone through whom he could dictate his book. And the third entity was a person who was on a higher level than the other 2 and had a very different perspective of reality. And so the 3 of them entered into this conversation in which they started working out experiments to understand the nature of perception at these 3 different levels. I forget the name of the character at the higher level, but he would say things like, I think I can perceive you physically. Now, move 6 inches to the right and let me see if I can perceive that shift on the physical level. These are very fascinating little attempts to understand reality at different levels in a way that's understandable to us. Anyway, this was part of her experience, or one of the initiating experiences of then, over a period of years, channeling T.E. Lawrence's book, which, from his point of view, was a painfully slow process. Her perception of the speed of dictation was much faster. He required a lot of patience to from his point of view and his perception of time to make this work. But eventually they did. And at first, he was very sensitive about his identity and didn't want it revealed. So she created a pseudonym for him. Scott is what she called him. But by the time the book was published, she felt that he had moved on in advance to a point where that would not matter to him, and so she correctly identified him as who he was. But getting back to the book, to his book itself, it's a wonderful account of progressive transformation from his human self and his human history to a deeper level of being and a better relationship with himself, which took time as it is experienced. Then it's a process that we all go through it if we engage in any kind of self-inquiry or psychotherapy or whatever to root out old patterns. And in this case, it was a lifetime of very deep old patterns. And I think the book probably just scratches the surface of what his real inner process was. But it's quite, I think, quite an outstanding document.
Book number 3, The Scole Experiment, Scientific Evidence for Life After Death, by Grant and Jane Solomon, published in 1999.
This was the book that sparked my interest in the Scole Experiment. I'd heard about it, but this book was a very well-written book, which, like the 85-minute feature documentary that I produced, only really scratches the surface of this 5-year experiment. This was undertaken. The experiment was undertaken by two couples in the tiny English village of Scole. It's this really tiny village established, I think, in the 1600s. It's about a half hour northeast of Cambridge, and you can walk through it in about 30 seconds. But in this town is a 17th century farmhouse, which was said to have been located at the intersection of several ley lines. And these are lines of energy in the earth, which are said to, in this case, facilitate communication across the Vale. They worked in the basement, the cellar of this farmhouse, which was quiet. It's radio silent, as it were, and allowed the participants to focus meditatively on connecting with the other side. The two couples involved, too, are prominent British mental mediums who made a connection with a experimental team on the other side. The other two participants were a couple who'd been involved in physical medium research for years, Robin and Sandra Foy. Anyway, they worked, the team on this side, the team on the other side worked together to create experiments to see to what extent the consciousness and form as it's perceived on the other side can be precipitated into physical evidence on our side. The book also dealt with the surveillance and scientific monitoring of this experiment, which for a period of 2 years was conducted by three investigators from the British Society for Psychical Research, which is actually a rather conservative and skeptical organization. But the three investigators were essentially, they were completely convinced, as were hundreds of visitors who joined this group over the 5-year course of the experiment, both in Scole and elsewhere. They did sessions in several European countries and in the United States. They did one session in Los Angeles at the home of a medium, Brian Hurst, who he had set up his garage as a session room. And I interviewed 10 years after this session. I interviewed a number of the participants in it, and they were still totally jazzed by the experience that they had there. Anyway, the evidence gathered over the course of the experiment included physical objects that appeared right on their seance table. It just sort of fall out of the air and drop on the table. They included electronic experiments of communication with the other side, a lot of photographic experiments that produced, for example, they would take rolls of 35 millimeter film and just put them on the table. And then when the folks on the other side thought they had produced something on the film, the experimenters were asked to develop the film. And what showed up on the film were black and white photographs that were said to be copies of photographs that existed somewhere in the world. And they were actually able to track a few of those down. Later, the films included drawings, kind of paintings, whimsical drawings, poems. One poem by William Wordsworth, signed W.W., which was a variation on one of his better-known poems called Ruth. Also included photographs of deceased individuals that they were able to identify, and also the signatures of some of these individuals. In one instance, one of the SPR investigators who was monitoring the experiment was interested in improving. They had set up a little tape recorder as an experimental device, and had a little device attached to it that the folks on the other side had instructed them to build. And Arthur Ellison, who was one of the investigators, asked the team on the other side, how can we improve this? And so on the next roll of film, they found a diagram with instructions about how to improve this electronic device, which was signed TAE, Thomas Alva Edison. and they found a copy of Edison's actual signature, and it matched completely. So these experiments were actually a lot of fun. There was quite a bit of humor in the exchanges, and just some really mind-blowing phenomena, such as claims of literal material. Robin Foy, one of the experimenters, claimed that his father and mother physically manifested in the room, that he could actually hug them and have a conversation with them.
Wow.
And this, I had heard accounts of materializations elsewhere, and I think this is one of the most profound results of this kind of work. It's one thing to have little bits of physical evidence, and quite something else to have a physical human manifest. And I didn't want to get off into this, but back in the 1960s, I met someone. I was with them for about 10 minutes, a friend of a friend, who we later found out had been dead for at least 2 years at the time when I had met him. And there was nothing about this person that was in any way unusual or suspect. So it was one of the things that allowed me to accept a lot of this and not just dismiss it out of hand. That there are. Go ahead, please.
Objects, you said there were objects that appeared out of nowhere. What kind of objects?
A variety of objects, small objects like coins, jewelry, trinkets, postcards, small things. But I think from my point of view, the most remarkable of these were two newspapers that had been printed in 1944 and 45, which appeared in 1995. One appeared when they were in conversation with a British medium by the name of Helen Duncan, who had died in the 40s. She actually was imprisoned during the Second World War because she somehow came upon information which was considered top secret, and she was imprisoned on espionage grounds. And Winston Churchill himself tried to intervene in the case and was unable to do so. And she was eventually released from prison, but she was a broken person and died shortly thereafter. So the Scole team, during their experiment, were in touch with her and conversing with her. And while they were communicating with Helen Duncan, this newspaper fell out of the air onto their table with a front page article about her. Now, I held this newspaper in my hand 5 years after it had appeared. And the outer pages had begun to yellow a bit, as old newsprint will, but the inside of the paper was white as it was printed. It would have taken, to have faked this would have taken huge resources, particularly because the paper stock, the newsprint stock it was printed on, Scole folks had it analyzed. It was wartime newsprint, which was had its own chemical signature, very distinct from paper produced since or today. So it's something that would have taken huge resources to have faked. And if I had no way of verifying these other objects that appeared, the newspaper really did it for me. All I can say is that the Grant and Jane Solomon's book would be the best place to start if anyone is interested in following up about the Scole Experiment. Also, the film that I made with Tim Coleman about the Scole Experiment. It's called Scole: The Afterlife Experiment, and I think you have the link to that you could put up with this video.
When did you release that film?
We actually released several versions of it in the early 2000 teens. Tim, my co-producer, released his own version of our work, and then we released what we call the director's cut, which is called Scole: The Afterlife Experiment. And it's both on Vimeo and YouTube. You can look it up that way. Or you can go to my website, dandrasin.com, DANDRASIN.com, and click on films, and you'll see them listed there.
Book number 4.
Okay.
Soul Survivor: The Reincarnation of World War II Fighter Pilot by Andrea and Bruce Leininger. with Ken Gross, published in 2009.
Right. One of my fascinations is young children reporting past life experiences. A friend of mine actually lives down the San Diego area of Southern California. When her young son was born a few years ago, as soon as he could talk, he would say things like, "Mom, this area used to belong to Mexico, and the architecture was different." And he would go into all this detail about his recollection of the time when Southern California belonged to Mexico. So, I have a prejudice that many of the things we call paranormal are perfectly normal, and that the notion that they're paranormal is more of a social definition than anything else. If we could talk about these things comfortably, without worrying about our reputations or being sent to the loony bin, I think we'd find that these phenomena and many others are perfectly normal, and we'd be more comfortable with them. We would know more about them, and we could discover more of the nature of our own being through acknowledging this. And I think at this point in our development of this as acknowledging these things generally, cases like the Leininger case are very important because they provide an evidential basis for understanding how we can go about discovering more of these situations, some of which are quite remarkable. In this case, the boy was James Leininger. As soon as he could, before he could talk, he was having chronic nightmares, which were inexplicable. And as soon as he could draw, he would draw pictures of air battles. And as soon as he could talk, he started speaking about his experience of having been shot down. And turns out his mother was sympathetic. His father was very skeptical initially on religious grounds, actually. But he came around eventually. He took young James, for example, to an air museum when James was, I think, about the age of 2 or thereabouts. And James pointed out, not in the museum, but in a book they found in the museum bookstore, the aircraft that he had piloted during the Second World War, and pointed out its features and its shortcomings. So this led his father to do some research in the U.S. Navy database. And meanwhile, young James had recalled the name of an aircraft carrier. Natoma was what he remembered. So his father searched the database and found there was indeed an aircraft carrier called the Natoma Bay, which had been stationed in the Sea of Japan late in the war. And he did find that an airman, James Houston, had been shot down in a particular battle. And eventually they found one of his wingmen, another pilot in that same operation, who had witnessed James Houston being shot down. And this started a process of reconnecting young James with his former life. They managed to find James Houston's surviving sister and introduced young James to her. And she was able to confirm his recollections of their family, including the fact that their father had been an alcoholic, and details like that. And then James's father brought young James to a reunion of the crew of the aircraft carrier, the surviving members. And James was able to name some of them. One of them, by his voice alone, remembered his voice. And he was sad. And he said, "I'm sad because everyone looks so old." So the story goes on and on and on. And the book Soul Survivor by James's parents, Bruce and Andrea Leininger, with a ghostwriter, Ken Gross, it's a wonderful read, and it's so highly evidential. I think it's one of the must reads of modern afterlife literature. And this, yeah, go ahead, please.
I was going to say, how old is the child now?
He's in his early 20s, give or take a few years. He normally, these memories tend to fade around the age of 6 or 7, when our left brain, as it were, starts to develop, and these intuitive impressions are soft pedaled. But in this case, I would imagine largely because of the spotlight that had been thrown on his experience, he was able to retain some of these memories up into his teen years, I believe. And his ambition is to be a pilot again, last I heard. There was a really beautiful incident, which I should mention also that ABC television in the United States had covered the Leininger case in a number of short documentaries. And in one of them, his parents took him on a boat to the place in the Sea of Japan where he had been shot down in the former life. And in this scene, he throws a bouquet of flowers into the water. And it is one of the most touching things I've ever seen.
I'm sure. Yeah, I'm sure.
So that's one of the reasons that this whole story is special to me, because it's something I really felt here. I have an affinity for aviation. I had been a student pilot years ago, and so this is a powerful story for me personally.
Mm-hmm. Book number 5, An Experiment with Time by J.W. Dunn, published in 1927. And he was one of the UK's early aircraft designers. Right.
And I discovered this book. I was staying with a friend in London back in the 1960s, and his apartment actually was haunted, which is a whole other funny, interesting story. But this friend of mine, Malcolm, had introduced me to this book that he found fascinating. And the experiment is a simple one. You keep very close track of your dreams for 2 weeks. You just keep a pad and pencil by your bed. When you wake up, before any other thought fills your mind, write down your dreams. And then when the 2 weeks are done, go back and reread what you wrote and see how many things you picked up which ended up happening in the future. Mm-hmm. Dunn, by the way, Dunn had his own theory of consciousness, which is itself interesting. I won't get too much into that. You can read the book. But I tried the experiment, and in one of the dreams, the one that stood out for me most, I'm driving on a country road, and I go over a little bridge, and from under the bridge on the right comes a bright yellow airplane. It's the type is called a PBY Catalina. It's a plane that's often used as a search and rescue, ocean search and rescue plane. It's an amphibious plane, and I was familiar with this plane, so I knew what it was when I saw it in the dream. It was just coming right out from under the bridge on one side. About a week later, I decided to explore Ireland. So I took a ferry over to Dublin, rented a car, and I'm driving west between Dublin and Galway. And as I'm driving on this, it was in a remote country road, this airplane reveals itself over the top of my windshield, flying in the same direction. And although it was a different direction than what I had seen in the dream, there was this progressive exposure of the plane to my vision, and it was the exact same airplane, this bright yellow PBY. So that was a lot of fun. I also found that doing the experiment revealed to me memories that I had suppressed. Now that was, to me, was the most fascinating and almost disturbing discovery. For example, a few years prior to that, I was living in Paris, and I would take a daily walk along the river, along the Seine, on the way to pick up my mail at the American Express office. And on one of these days, I walked by a body that had just been dredged up out of the river. It was very ugly. It was muddy and rigid and everything. And I walked fairly close to this body. Within 10 minutes, I had erased that memory. It was as if it had never happened until I did this experiment with time. And in one of the dreams during that two-week period, I dreamt of walking along the river and seeing two men in a rowboat dredging a body up out of the water. And I woke up and I said, "Oh my God. I erased that experience from my memory, from my conscious memory immediately. What else have I erased?" And
Did you find out?
I don't know. I didn't do the experiment. I imagine I could do the experiment again explicitly to to bring up suppressed memories, but I've been too busy with other things. Right? That's my excuse. So anyway, that was my takeaway from this book, and everyone will have their own experience with it. But I think it's really good because it's something you can actually experiment. You can actually do yourself to take a peek into level of your own consciousness.
Book number 6, The World of Ted Sirius, Thoughtographic, great word, Thoughtographic Studies of an Extraordinary Mind by Joel Eisenbud, 1967. Thoughtographic.
Yes, this was, as far as I know, a unique talent. There may be other folks who were able to do this, but this is the only one we have a record of. Joel Eisenbud was a medical doctor based in Denver, Colorado, and he was somehow put in touch with Ted Sirius, who is this unemployed Chicago bellhop who was able to impress images from his mind onto Polaroid film. For those who aren't familiar with it, this is a very popular form of photography. Back then, you can still, Polaroid cameras still exist. They're instant cameras where you take the picture and the print comes right out of the camera and develops itself in a few minutes. And Sirius was evidently able to concentrate his thoughts and project images onto film at the moment where the experimenter or the tester would snap the shutter. And he produced, I suppose, hundreds of these photos. And Eisenbud documented this work over a period of several years and published actually several editions of this book, which it's a good case study in how to approach these kind of phenomena scientifically. Most of if you read about this in Wikipedia, which is notorious for its casual skepticism, you'll read all kinds of BS about it. But the actual research work was quite rigorous, and curiously, Sirius's talent waned after a while, and he knew that at some point he says, "I'm sorry, I can't do this anymore." And I forget what the final image was that he produced, but it was connected with this idea of conclusion. I think it was an image of curtains. Now, why he was able to do this, we don't know. Whether other people are able to do this, we don't know. At least they haven't spoken up yet. But the evidence speaks for itself. These photographs have certain anomalies in them that can really only be explained in terms of mental impressions. For example, there's one photograph of a particular building, which is a known place, a known building, of which ordinary photographs exist that can be compared with the photograph. And the photograph has certain odd distortions in it that really could only have been produced by Photoshop, for example. But Photoshop didn't exist until 1989, and this was back in the 1960s. So, there were no digital photographs at that point. So these distortions could not have been explained in any kind of conventional way. These photographs were documented pretty much as soon as they came out of the camera. So here again, you have another instance of precipitation or manifestation, or whatever you want to call it,
Yeah.
from some level of the mind, whether it was Sirius's personal mind or some other minds on the other side aggregating this visual information in some way and being able to project it. We don't have the language to really nail that down. But the evidence is there. And I think for me, that's the important thing. And we can theorize till the cows come home, but the physical evidence, the undeniable physical evidence is there, as with the Scole Experiment and these other situations. And that's what has intrigued me most about this whole avenue of research and discovery. You can argue about the details, but you can't argue about the physical evidence.
Absolutely. Book number 7. Now, this is a book that comes up over and over again. It's recommended so many times, rightly so. Journey of Souls, Case Studies of Life Between Lives by Michael Newton, published in 1994.
Well, I stumbled on Newton's work not long after this book was published. And I thought it was very compelling, partly because he started work during the 1970s as a conventionally trained hypnotherapist. And when some of his clients started, in deep hypnosis sessions particularly, started reporting these experiences from between lives, he first kind of dismissed it. But after a number of his clients reported very similar experiences, the same patterns, he sort of threw up his hands and said, wait a minute, we got to be scientific about this. And so he started recording these sessions and comparing them carefully. And out of this work came the 2 books, Journey of Souls, is a following book, Destiny of Souls as well, that described these hypnosis sessions, the experiences reported there, and also the commonalities among these experiences. One of which was at a certain point in the between lives process, a reuniting with one's soul group. And Newton's work was, I would say, in terms of our modern Western information, almost seminal in spotlighting the notion of the soul group, at least in terms of my own reading and understanding. And that is that we're part of a family on the other side that is more extensive, say, than our families and organizations and membership societies on this side, and that consciousness is shared among the members of this group. So our individuality on that level is relative. We still have a discernible identity, but the identity has more permeable boundaries. And our experience includes not just our personal individual experience, say of the immediately preceding lifetime, but also of that of the collective experience of the group. So the whole idea of the self as a rigidly contained entity is kind of expanded and softened by this. This is kind of anathema to our physically oriented notions of reality, but not entirely. I mean, when skeptics, when you ask a skeptic what's real, what will they do? They'll pound on a table and they'll say, "This is reality," as if the physical world consisted only of solid matter. But the physical world also contains liquids and gases. We live in this sea of air without which we couldn't exist. So the whole idea of materialism psychologically tends to be focused on something called solidity. And solidity, one of the corollaries of solidity is boundaries. Things are rigidly defined. This is a headphone, and this is my head, and there's a rigid boundary obvious boundary between the two. On the other side, things are not quite so cut and dry. There are permeable boundaries between defined entities. We can say, yes, we're a soul, and you got to fudge the definition a bit, because there's a permeability and there's shared energy, shared reality, shared impressions, shared memories. So things are not quite so easily pigeonholed in the realm of consciousness. And that's one of the things that makes it hard to grasp, particularly people who are skeptical or are fearful of exploring these realms. But I think the more we explore them, even secondhand through books, the more comfortable we can get with a more expanded and maybe soft-edged view of reality. In my book, the longest chapter in my own book is about semantics, about how language determines how we create our reality.
Yes.
And
Yeah.
I have this kind of a glossary there of terms. One of my favorites is we use words like somebody, nobody, everybody. And every time we use the word, doesn't it reinforce the idea that we're nothing but our bodies? That kind of thing. But I also take on the definition of the word reality and show how subjective it is. And the only reliable definition I could come up with is reality is whatever can give rise to consequences. I mean, physical consequences, consequences in consciousness, in the imagination, and so on. And if someone can come up with a better definition, I'm fine with that. But that was as far as I was able to get. So hopefully it loosens up the whole notion of what's ultimately real and unreal.
Yeah.
I mean, the fact that life exists at all is ultimately a mystery to the materialists. They can reduce it to physiochemical processes all they want, but that doesn't really explain. It's still a mystery.
Book number 8. We probably only have about 25 minutes left. We've got 3 more books to get through, and I do want to talk to you about the electronics that are facilitating the communication and a little bit more about your own books. So we're going to have to speed up our descriptions a bit. So book number 8, 7 questions about life after life, a collaboration between 2 souls, one incarnate on Earth and one on the other side, who share a greater reality, by Cynthia Spring and Frances Vaughan, published in 2019. That's a long title.
Right. This is the first of 3 books that were channeled by my personal friend of mine, Cynthia Spring. Frances Vaughan was a well-known transpersonal psychologist. She died in 2017, actually on my birthday. I'd never known her personally, but Cynthia was a good friend and a good friend of Frances. Cynthia, at one point, learned to do automatic writing, which was a vehicle for Frances coming through and working with her on this a series of 3 books that were channeled. And I put it in here partly because it's a really good primer for people who are just getting their feet wet in exploring the notion of an afterlife. Frances is very articulate. She, for example, has come up with a concept of that on the other side, we're not going to make predictions about what's going on Earth, but we have what I call a balcony view of human affairs. And I like that term. It's like an overview that's not involved, but we can see a broader view. It doesn't mean we can see everything and predict the trajectory of everything. So I think this is a really good book for beginners. It's a very kind book, a very simple book, very straightforward, and very sympathetic. The fact that I personally related to these folks was a plus for me. It's another level of evidentiality and personal connection. And Frances Vaughan herself, actually, from the other side, has been of assistance to me in regard to a personal issue, where she actually counseled me as a psychologist through another medium that I work with. So that's a whole other story. So I'm very, very comfortable with this communication across the veil. It's just natural for me, and in some ways it's been a lot of fun. which is a whole other part of the story I won't get into now. But it's also very freeing, obviously. When we drop our fear of death,
Yes.
and it becomes a curiosity and an adventure, life itself becomes a very different thing.
Yeah.
So,
number 9.
Okay.
This one has been mentioned. We've actually had Matthew Mackay on the show. This is The Luminous Landscape of the Afterlife, Jordan's message to the living on what to expect after death. Matthew Mackay is a publisher, among other things, and this book was published in 2021.
Yes, Matthew is Mackay, and he lives in the San Francisco Bay Area, not far from where I live. He's a publisher, also a psychologist. And
Yes.
when his son Jordan, who lived over in San Francisco, was murdered one night in the city, this obviously was a huge loss to Matthew, who eventually began to practice automatic writing, good old automatic writing. And his son Jordan, or his son Jordan's larger self, started coming through and dictated 3 books, of which this is the 3rd, I believe. And it's a wonderful sort of how-to manual for what to expect when you're crossing over. It's really it's written in very accessible language, very straightforward, matter of fact, and it's like your how-to manual that you wish you could take with you when you cross over to consult. This is a digression, but I recently stumbled on this book called The Beginner's Guide for the Recently Deceased. I wonder if you have run into it. But
I've never seen that before.
It's by David Staume, Staume, and I've only gotten part way into it, but it was almost not word for word, but very similar to Jordan Mackay's description of what to expect as you cross over. There's some differences, but the general idea is the same. And the primary thing to understand is how your own consciousness gives rise to what you perceive as reality.
Yes.
It's your own process of projection becomes, not just an inner process, but it appears you project what you take to be the outer reality. For those who are prepared for this, it's a wonderful, it's a surefire way a surefire way of introspection. I mean, imagine if even in life we could sit in a theater and see our subconscious thoughts projected on the screen in front of us. We'd have something to work with there in terms of our own self-understanding and maturity, and even in our ordinary human life. But this is just the way things work on the other side when you first get over there. This was very, very evident in the T.E. Lawrence book, his experience of understanding how just his emotions, which are normally private to us in our physical lives, that others can see them and are directly impacted by them on the other side. And so he had to learn, first of all, what those emotions were that he had suppressed, and then be able to unwind that energy so that they didn't affect others that he was with. Because he found that if he couldn't do that, others would be repelled by his emotions, which took on almost a physical quality on the other side. And so these books that give us a hint of what to expect as we cross over, I find are very valuable, and also to help diminish fear of death.
Yeah.
And I think that on a very practical level, if we were less afraid of death, that we would be more motivated to prepare appropriately for it. Just in the details of life, the legal and financial and burial, or all of that we would not leave so much. So we wouldn't be throwing this on the shoulders of our loved ones to have to deal with.
Yeah.
Anyway, so that's my prejudice about it. Okay, finally, on to my own book.
You're onto your own book, A New Science of the Afterlife, Space, Time, and the Consciousness Code.
Right.
2023. You
Right.
say this is your first attempt to summarize your own discoveries and understandings about the greater reality.
Right. Folks have been prodding me for years to write a book, and I finally got down to it a few years ago. And it's a it's an I sometimes tell people I wrote it for wives to put under their skeptical husbands' pillows. It's an attempt to express my understanding of the nature of the afterlife in sober and concrete terms. It's a very unromantic book. It also tries to not be too analytic and too left-brained. So I hope that I've managed to strike a balance with it. Tried to insert enough little inside jokes and humor to make it palatable, and it's gotten some quite good reviews. And I've been on 25 podcasts so far, I think. So it's finding its way into the subculture, and hopefully into the
It's
mainstream culture a bit.
huge interest in these subjects now. Massive. Yeah.
Yeah.
Tell me about the electronic technology. I mean, I know that
Right.
Professor Gary Schwartz, has been working with technology. I've seen a video of a lecture he gave. I couldn't say that there was anything in there that convinced me of anything. So,
Yeah.
what are they using? Is it like a phone?
Well, the easiest way to look at this is to go back into the history of it. Electronic communication from the other side was first discovered back in the 1950s when tape recorders first became consumer items. And occasionally, people would hear on their tapes voices that didn't belong there. They're usually faint, but definitely discernible. And in the United States, this is generally dismissed as, well, maybe the machine is picking up a radio broadcast or something. But in Europe, these voices were taken a little more seriously, and a number of researchers and experimenters became involved. The first one that we know of was a Swedish man named Friedrich Jurgensen, who was a well-known um, documentary filmmaker and artist. He was even an opera singer. So he was a well-known personality. And he was working on a documentary about birds. And so one night he was out with his recorder recording nocturnal bird sounds. So when he played back the tape, between the nocturnal bird sounds, according to the legend, he heard faint voices discussing nocturnal bird sounds. And his first response was, "Oh, isn't that interesting? It must be picking up some radio discussion about bird sounds. What a coincidence!" But then, shortly thereafter, on one of his tapes, he heard the voice of his mother calling him by his childhood nickname, which no one else knew. And that did it for him. He said, "Okay, now we got to be scientific about this. Something's happening here." And so he started intentionally recording these voices. He would roll the tape, he would ask a question, leave a period of silence, and so on. And when he played the tape back, in those gaps, he would hear responses to his questions. He was soon joined by a Latvian researcher named Konstantin Raudava, worked with Jurgensen for a while, then went off and did his own experiments. And by the time he died in 1974, he'd recorded 70,000, between 60 and 70,000 of these voices. He actually issued a phonograph record that reproduced some of his experiments where he would ask a question and the response would come in a quite clearly audible way in 6 different languages, which was interesting because he spoke 6 different languages. And this has been one of the interesting patterns that have been discovered, that electronic voices coming through from the other side will speak whatever language you speak or understand, language or languages. So which is a really intriguing feature of this process. So obviously minds are involved on a number of levels. And in a way, a language can be called a mind of its own because it has certain assumptions, qualities, powers that are exclusive to the language. And that can be even the difference between, say, British and American English, where certain words actually have opposite meanings. But I won't get off on that. Uh, that a language represents a collective psyche, you might say, in terms of national identity, cultural identity. The tastes of a culture are embodied in its language. So the idea that language can be manifest from the other side to me is a very potent thing that I think we've really only, after 50, 60 years, have really only begun to explore. When this phenomenon became better known, ordinary folks started using their home tape recorders, their cassette recorders, which came along in the 1960s, and then digital recorders came along later, and even smartphones now. And in my film Calling Earth, you'll see quite a few samples of these communications that have come through in a number of languages, people around the world, and some people who, like my friend Vicky Talbot, who you'll see in the film, has been communicating with her son since he died in 2001, shortly before 9/11, actually, in a kayaking accident up in Washington State. And Braden's been communicating with his mom ever since, as well as Braden's friend who died with him in the kayaking accident. They both shown up in a lot of these communications. So this isn't just some crazy thing; it's happening, and a lot of people are cottoning onto it and practicing it themselves. There was a period in the late 1980s when a lot of people were involved in getting really wonderful results. And then a curious thing happened within this society of folks who were very practicing this very successfully. A schism developed. One person had accused someone else of faking it or something like that. And as a result of the schism, what they call the contact field collapsed. And suddenly it became much harder for individuals to receive these communications from the other side. And that culture has not reconstituted itself yet. And so while people are certainly continuing to get results, some of them quite spectacular, the collective momentum that was facilitated by this cooperative movement has yet to be reconstituted. But in spite of that, it still works. It just doesn't work as well. We don't understand all the factors that contribute to success or failure in this area. Some people feel that it works better during the waxing phase of the moon. I don't know of any research that's actually been done to determine that. And everyone's. It seems to work best when people discover in their own way how to do it, whatever's most comfortable for them and most familiar. When people try to use technology that's too sophisticated, it becomes very complicated and difficult. It seems to work best with whatever the simplest technology is that you can access and feel familiar and comfortable with. There are some experiments being done. Gary Schwartz, who you mentioned, is one person who's been experimenting with digital systems. There's other people that I'm in touch with, one of whom who's gotten some pretty interesting results. I think Gary Schwartz's stated goal, which is to produce what he calls a soul phone, which would work like a direct telephone. I think it's an interesting goal to pursue. Whether that's ever possible, I don't know. I don't think it works that way. It's not not an entirely objective process. I mean, we try to bring as much objective technology into it as possible to give us a framework of belief, of confidence, I would say, in the process. But if it ever works as simply as a telephone, I'll be surprised. I don't say it's impossible, but
we're out of time now.
okay.
So I'm going to have to ask you one last very quick question
Sure.
that we ask all our guests, and that is that Steve Jobs famously gave every attendee at his memorial a copy of Paramahansa Yogananda's Autobiography of a Yogi. What book would you want to pass on to your memorial guests?
Oh, wow. To quote Steve Jobs, oh, wow, which was supposed to have been his last words. You put me on the spot here because there are so many good books.
You just got
I would say if there were one book in my list to pass on, it would probably be the Scole Experiment, because it just because it's so undeniable.
Yeah, good. That's what we want. Well, I'm afraid that's all we've got time for. Thank you so much for joining us today, Dan Drasin.
It's been my pleasure, Sandie.
So for more information about Daniel Drasin's films, photography, projects, and his book, A New Science of the Afterlife, visit his website at dandrasin.com. That's it for this week. I'm Sandie Sedgbeer. I'll be back at the same time next week with another 10 Best interview for the No BS Spiritual Book Club. Till then, it's goodbye from me. Thank you again to Dan.
Thank you again, Sandie.
If today's conversation sparked your curiosity, you'll love our other shows. The Synergy Sessions, where leading-edge thinkers collide in bold, unscripted dialogues that ignite new possibilities. Between Realms and Reason, where we journey into the mysterious consciousness, energy, and the hidden layers of reality, where science converges with spirit in ways you've never imagined. And the No BS Spiritual Book Club, where leading-edge new thought speakers, teachers, authors, and luminaries who've walked this path before you share the 10 books that had the biggest impact on their life journey. All 3 shows are available on YouTube, Spotify, Substack, and all major podcast platforms. For more information, visit sedgbeer.com. That's SEDGBEER.com.